At my husband's inheritance meeting, my own son looked me in the eye and said coldly, "Mother has no rights here. Father left nothing for her." The room erupted in cruel laughter. I sat, frozen, head bowed in humiliation. Then the lawyer unlocked the safe, and a video began to play. My husband's face appeared on screen, and his first words were, "Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories." My name is Margaret Ann Whitmore, and I'm 72 years old. For 50 years, I was a devoted wife and mother who poured every ounce of love and energy into building a home and family. I never worked outside our house because my husband Richard believed a strong family needed someone at its foundation, someone who would be there consistently without distraction. That someone was me. I accepted this role willingly, even eagerly, because I believed in the vision we were building together. When I married Richard at 22, I had just received an acceptance letter to a teaching program at the state university. I remember holding that letter in my hands, feeling the weight of possibility and dreams. But Richard had different plans. He was starting his consulting business and needed support. "Maggie," he said, holding my face gently in his hands, "we don't need two careers pulling us in different directions. I need you to build our home while I build our future. Can you do that for us?" His eyes were so earnest, so full of love and promise, that I folded that acceptance letter and placed it in a drawer. I never looked at it again. Over the decades that followed, I became the invisible thread holding everything together. I cooked every meal from scratch, refusing to serve my family anything less than home-cooked love. I mended every torn shirt, sewed buttons back on suits before important meetings, and kept our home spotless and welcoming. When our children, David, Patricia, and Michael, were young, I sat through countless sleepless nights, nursing fevers, soothing nightmares, and helping with homework until my eyes burned with exhaustion. I attended every soccer game, every piano recital, every parent-teacher conference. I was always there. I sacrificed more than just career dreams. I gave up friendships because I didn't have time to maintain them. I stopped painting, something I'd loved since childhood, because there were always more pressing needs. When Richard's mother developed cancer, I became her primary caregiver for 2 years, managing her medications, doctor appointments, and dignity in her final days. Richard was too busy with work, so it fell to me. I never complained. That wasn't who I was. People in our neighborhood knew me well. Mrs. Chen from next door called me the angel of patience, because she never once heard me raise my voice or speak an unkind word about anyone. The mailman knew I'd have fresh lemonade waiting on summer days. Local. Kids knew my kitchen always had cookies available. I volunteered at the church food pantry every Tuesday for 20 years. I organized community fundraisers, collected donations for families in need, and always showed up when someone needed help. I lived my entire adult life believing that kindness, sacrifice, and unconditional love were the currency that mattered most. I thought that by giving everything to my family, I was building something permanent and beautiful, a legacy of love that would protect and sustain me when I needed it most. But that day in the lawyer's office, surrounded by the children I'd raised and the legacy of the husband I'd served, I learned the cruelest lesson of my life. Sacrifice without boundaries isn't nobility. Sometimes it's just invisibility. And invisible people, I discovered, are easy to erase. Before Richard passed away 6 months ago, our life seemed picture perfect from the outside. We lived in a beautiful colonial-style home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where children rode bikes safely and neighbors knew each other's names. The house had been our dream. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, and a backyard large enough for the garden I'd always wanted. Every morning I'd wake at sunrise and spend an hour among my roses, tomatoes, and herbs, finding peace in the soil and the rhythm of nature. Richard and I had developed comfortable routines over our 50 years together. He'd come downstairs at exactly 7 o'clock, dressed in his crisp suit, reading glasses perched on his nose as he scanned the morning newspaper. I'd have his coffee ready, 2 sugars, a splash of cream, and his breakfast waiting. Scrambled eggs, whole wheat toast, and fresh fruit arranged just the way he liked it. Before leaving for work, he'd kiss my forehead tenderly and say, "What would I do without you, Maggie?" Those small moments felt like validation that I'd chosen the right path. I'd pack his lunch every single day, even after he retired and only went to the office occasionally. Inside the brown paper bag, alongside his sandwich and apple, I'd tuck a handwritten note. Sometimes it was just, "I love you." Other times, a funny observation or a reminder of a happy memory. Richard kept every single note in a box in his study. At least I thought he did. It made me feel connected to him, even when we were apart. Our 3 children had all grown into successful adults, which filled me with tremendous pride. David, our eldest, had become a corporate lawyer at a prestigious downtown firm. He wore expensive suits and drove a luxury car, always talking about his latest case or important client. Patricia, our middle child, had married a wealthy businessman named Gregory. They lived in a mansion across town with a pool and tennis court. Patricia spent her days shopping, attending charity luncheons, and managing her household staff. Michael, our youngest, ran his own consulting firm, following in his father's footsteps. He traveled frequently for work but always seemed energetic and ambitious. Sunday dinners were sacred in our family. Every week, without fail, everyone gathered at our house. I'd start preparing on Friday, marinating meats, baking pies, making sure every detail was perfect. The dining room table would be set with our good china, fresh flowers in the centerpiece, and enough food to feed a small army. David would arrive with his briefcase, often taking work calls even during dinner. Patricia would bring her children and talk about her latest vacation plans or home renovation. Michael usually showed up last, apologizing for being late but always wearing that charming smile. Richard would sit at the head of the table, surveying his family with satisfaction. He'd raise his glass and make a toast to family, the greatest wealth a man can have. Then he'd reach over and squeeze my hand, his eyes crinkling with warmth. "We built something beautiful, Maggie. Look at them. All successful, all happy. You did this." Those words made every sacrifice feel worthwhile. My grandchildren, 4 beautiful souls ranging from ages 6 to 14, would fight over who got to sit next to Nana. They'd tell me about school, show me their drawings, and beg me to tell stories about when their parents were young. After dinner, while the adults talked in the living room, I'd do dishes and pack leftovers for everyone to take home. Patricia never offered to help, saying she had staff for that sort of thing. I didn't mind. This was my role, my purpose, my joy. Those Sunday gatherings felt like proof that all my years of devotion had created something lasting and meaningful. I felt blessed, secure, and surrounded by love. I had no idea that behind those smiles and pleasant conversations, a betrayal was already taking shape. About 2 weeks after Richard's funeral, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten with an unfamiliar unease. It was a Sunday, and the family had gathered for dinner as usual. I'd insisted on maintaining the tradition despite my grief, believing that keeping our routines would help us all heal together. I'd spent the entire day cooking Richard's favorite dishes: pot roast with roasted vegetables, garlic mashed potatoes, and apple pie with vanilla ice cream. It felt like honoring his memory, keeping him present in some small way. The dinner itself had seemed normal enough, though painfully incomplete without Richard at the head of the table. We ate. We talked about surface-level things: weather, work, the children's school activities. But something felt off, like a musical note played slightly out of tune. The conversation had an artificial quality, as if everyone was performing their lines rather than genuinely connecting. I attributed it to grief. We were all still adjusting to the gaping hole Richard had left in our lives. After dinner, I was in the kitchen wrapping leftovers when I heard low voices coming from the hallway. I recognized David's deep tone and Patricia's higher pitch, speaking in hushed, urgent whispers. Curious, I dried my hands on my apron and walked toward the sound, my footsteps soft on the hardwood floor. As I rounded the corner into the kitchen doorway, I saw them standing close together near the back door, their heads bent in conversation. David was holding some kind of document, though I couldn't see what it was from my angle. The moment they heard me approach, they jumped apart like guilty teenagers caught plotting mischief. The paper David had been holding disappeared into his jacket pocket with a swift, practiced motion. Their faces transformed instantly. David's serious expression melted into a broad smile, and Patricia's furrowed brow smoothed as she laughed a little too loudly at nothing in particular. "Oh, Mom!" Patricia exclaimed brightly, her voice unnaturally cheerful. "We were just talking about Dad's old stories. Remember how he used to exaggerate his fishing tales?" I stood there, dish towel still in my hands, studying their faces. Something about their expressions seemed wrong. The smiles were too wide, too forced, not reaching their eyes. David stepped forward and put his arm around my shoulders, steering me back toward the dining room. "How are your tomato plants doing, Mom? I remember you said the ones in the back weren't getting enough sun." It was such an abrupt change of subject, so clearly designed to distract me, that my unease deepened. "They're fine," I said slowly, searching his face for clues. "What were you two really discussing?" David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Nothing important, just estate stuff. Boring legal details you don't need to worry about." Patricia nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly, just paperwork. Gregory deals with this kind of thing all the time. It's terribly dull." They were talking to me like I was a child who couldn't understand grown-up matters, and it stung more than I wanted to admit. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening just outside my awareness. I caught David and Patricia exchanging meaningful glances across the room. When Michael arrived late, they pulled him aside for a brief, whispered conversation that stopped the moment I came near. Every instinct I'd developed over 7 decades told me something was wrong, but I had no concrete evidence, just a mother's intuition and the uncomfortable sensation of being deliberately excluded from something important. That night, after everyone had left and the house fell silent, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, that grief was making me see shadows where none existed, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept replaying those whispered conversations, those 2 bright smiles, and the document disappearing into David's pocket. I spent the entire week following that Sunday dinner, convincing myself I was imagining things. Every time doubt crept into my mind, I pushed it away with logical explanations and memories of happier times. My children loved me. Richard had loved me. We were a solid family built on 50 years of dedication and sacrifice. Grief does strange things to people's minds, I told myself repeatedly. It makes you paranoid, makes you see threats where none exist, turns innocent moments into sinister conspiracies. During those long days, I kept myself busy with the routines that had always brought me comfort. I tended my garden with extra attention, pulling weeds that didn't exist and watering plants that were already perfectly hydrated. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, scrubbing floors that were already spotless, organizing closets that didn't need organizing. Physical activity kept my mind from wandering into dark places, from asking questions I wasn't ready to face. Maybe David and Patricia had simply been stressed about handling their father's estate, I reasoned. Legal matters after a death were complicated. I knew that much even without understanding the details. Perhaps they were trying to shield me from boring paperwork and difficult decisions during my time of mourning. That would be thoughtful, wouldn't it? Protective, even. They were probably discussing financial details, tax implications, business transitions, things that would only confuse and overwhelm me. Richard had always handled our finances. I'd never even balanced a checkbook. Why would they burden me with complex legal language and technical details? Every night before bed, I'd sit in Richard's study, surrounded by his books and the faint scent of his cologne that still lingered in the fabric of his chair. I'd look at our wedding photo on the desk, both of us so young, so full of hope and dreams. Richard's arm was wrapped around my waist, his smile genuine and proud. In that photograph, I could see the promise we'd made to each other, to build a life together, to take care of each other, to create something lasting. Until death do us part, we'd vowed, but we'd also promised for better or worse, for richer or poorer. Richard had been a man of his word throughout our entire marriage. When I had emergency surgery 20 years ago, he'd taken time off work to care for me. When my father passed away, Richard had held me through countless nights of tears. When money was tight in the early years, he'd worked extra hours to make sure we never went without. He wasn't perfect. He could be stubborn, sometimes distant when work consumed him, but he'd always been honorable. I couldn't imagine him leaving me unprotected or vulnerable after his death. That simply wasn't who he was. I reminded myself of all the times he'd called me his partner, his anchor, his better half. Just months before he died, even when the illness was draining his strength, he'd pulled me close and whispered, "You're the best decision I ever made, Maggie." Those words had felt like a blessing, a validation of every choice I'd made. Every dream I'd surrendered. A man who said things like that wouldn't betray his wife. It was impossible. As for my children, I'd raise them to be good people. Yes, they were busy with their own lives, sometimes distracted or self-absorbed, but that was normal for successful adults in their 40s. Underneath their professional exteriors, they were still the babies I'd nursed, the toddlers I'd comforted after nightmares, the teenagers I'd guided through heartbreaks and disappointments. That bond couldn't simply disappear. Blood was thicker than water. Family was everything. By the end of that week, I'd almost convinced myself that the whispering, the sudden silence when I entered rooms, the mysterious document, all of it was innocent. I was being oversensitive, reading malice into ordinary moments. Everything would be fine. The will reading was scheduled for the following week, and then all this uncertainty would be resolved. I'd receive whatever Richard had left for me, the estate would be settled, and life would continue. We'd heal together as a family, but deep in my chest, in a place I refused to acknowledge, a tiny voice whispered that I was lying to myself. 3 days before the scheduled will reading, my carefully constructed denial came crashing down in the most unexpected way. David had stopped by the house that Tuesday afternoon, saying he needed to pick up some of his father's old business files from the study. I'd been thrilled to see him, interpreting the visit as a sign that maybe I'd been wrong about my suspicions. Maybe my son was simply busy, not distant. Maybe everything really was fine. I'd made him his favorite sandwich, turkey with Swiss cheese, lettuce, and that special honey mustard he'd loved since childhood. We'd sat in the kitchen making small talk about his work, a big case he was handling, the weather. It felt almost normal, almost like the relationship we'd had before Richard's death. When he finished eating, he went upstairs to the study while I cleaned up the lunch dishes, humming softly to myself, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. About 20 minutes later, David came back downstairs carrying a small box of files. "Found what I needed, Mom," he said, checking his watch. "I have to run, client meeting in an hour." He set his briefcase down on the hall table while he put on his coat, distracted and hurried as always. We hugged briefly, and he promised to call me later in the week. Then he was gone, his car pulling out of the driveway before I'd even closed the front door. I went back to the kitchen to finish wiping down the counters. That's when I noticed he'd left his briefcase behind. It was sitting on the hall table, abandoned in his rush. I picked it up, intending to call him immediately so he could come back for it, but then I remembered he'd said he was heading straight to a client meeting. He'd need it. My motherly instinct kicked in. I'd drive it to his office myself. It was only 15 minutes away, and I had nothing else planned for the afternoon. I carried the briefcase to the living room and set it on the coffee table while I went to fetch my purse and car keys. But as I placed it down, the latch popped open. The briefcase wasn't locked, and it fell open, papers spilling across the table. "Oh no," I muttered, kneeling down to gather the documents before they scattered further. I wasn't snooping. I was simply trying to put everything back in order. That's when I saw it. A document with an official-looking header that read, "Estate Division Plan, Whitmore Family Trust." My hands began to shake as I picked it up, telling myself I shouldn't read it, that it was private legal business. But my eyes were already scanning the page, unable to stop, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The document laid out everything in brutal clinical detail. David was to receive the primary business assets valued at $3 million. Patricia would inherit the 2 vacation properties, the lake house and the beach cottage, worth approximately $1.5 million combined. Michael would receive the investment portfolio, stocks and bonds carefully accumulated over decades, worth just over $2 million. The numbers swam before my eyes, each one representing years of Richard's work, years of our life together. I kept searching for my name, certain it would appear with my share, my security, my future. Finally, I found it. A single line near the bottom of the page, barely more than a footnote. My hands trembled so violently I almost dropped the paper. The notation read, "Primary residence, estimated value $800,000, to be sold immediately following probate. Proceeds to be divided equally among 3 children. M.W. wife, to be offered guest house accommodation on Patricia's property, if housing assistance is required." I read that line 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, certain I was misunderstanding the legal language. But there was no misunderstanding possible. Those words were crystal clear. They were planning to sell my home, the house where I'd raised them, where every room held memories of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, where I'd nursed sick children and celebrated graduations, where Richard and I had built our entire life together. They were going to sell it and divide the money among themselves, like I was already gone, already dead, already erased. And I wasn't even being given a portion of the proceeds. I was being offered charity, a guest house on my daughter's property, if housing assistance was required. The clinical cold phrasing made it clear exactly what they thought of me. I wasn't a beneficiary. I wasn't family. I was a potential burden to be managed, a problem to be solved with the minimum necessary resources. The paper slipped from my fingers and floated back to the coffee table. I sat there on my knees, surrounded by scattered legal documents, feeling like the floor had opened beneath me and I was falling into an endless void. This wasn't grief playing tricks on my mind. This wasn't paranoia or oversensitivity. This was real, documented, planned. My children, the babies I had carried in my body, nourished with my milk, raised with every ounce of love I possessed, had sat down with lawyers and financial advisors and calculated my worth, and they'd determined it was nothing. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes in the air, and somewhere outside, a bird was singing. Life was continuing normally all around me while my entire world shattered into pieces. I thought about calling David immediately, demanding an explanation, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking enough to hold the phone. Besides, what would I say? What explanation could possibly make this acceptable? I carefully gathered all the papers and put them back in the briefcase, my movements mechanical and numb. Then I called David and told him in a voice that sounded surprisingly steady that he'd left his briefcase behind. He said he'd pick it up the next day. I didn't mention what I'd seen. Some instinct told me to stay quiet, to observe, to understand the full scope of what was happening before revealing that I knew anything at all. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay in the bed I'd shared with Richard for 50 years, staring at the ceiling, and felt the first stirrings of something I'd never allowed myself to feel toward my children before. Not just hurt or disappointment, but something sharper, something that tasted like betrayal. And beneath that, buried even deeper, the faintest ember of anger beginning to glow. The day of the inheritance meeting arrived with gray skies that matched my mood perfectly. I'd barely slept for 3 nights, my mind endlessly replaying that estate division document, analyzing every word, searching for alternative interpretations that might make it less devastating. I found none. That morning, I dressed carefully in a simple navy dress and pearl earrings, the ones Richard had given me on our 25th anniversary. I wanted to look dignified, composed, like the woman who'd held this family together for half a century. I had no idea I was dressing for my own execution. The lawyer's office was in a downtown building with marble floors and dark wood paneling that smelled of old money and power. I arrived exactly on time, my purse clutched tightly in my hands, my heart hammering against my ribs. The receptionist directed me to a conference room on the 3rd floor. When I opened the heavy door, all 3 of my children were already seated around a long mahogany table. That detail struck me immediately. They'd arrived early together without telling me. They'd coordinated. Not one of them stood when I entered. Not one of them came to embrace me or ask how I was holding up. David glanced up from his phone with a brief nod. Patricia offered a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Michael at least had the decency to look uncomfortable, shifting in his chair and avoiding direct eye contact. I took the seat at the far end of the table, the one farthest from everyone else, feeling like an outsider at my own husband's will reading. Mr. Harrison, Richard's longtime lawyer, sat at the head of the table looking somber and official. A younger associate sat beside him with a laptop, ready to take notes. "Thank you all for coming," Mr. Harrison began in a carefully neutral tone. "We're here today for the reading of Richard Whitmore's last will and testament, executed on March 15th of this year." March 15th. Just 7 months ago. The date stuck in my mind because that was right after Richard's dementia diagnosis, during the period when he'd been increasingly confused and paranoid. The lawyer began reading from the document in a flat, professional monotone. I, Richard James Whitmore, being of sound mind and body. The words washed over me as he detailed the division of the business assets to David, the vacation properties to Patricia, the investment portfolio to Michael. Each bequest was read aloud with dollar amounts that made my children sit a little straighter, their eyes gleaming with barely concealed satisfaction. I watched them, these strangers wearing my children's faces, and felt something cold settling in my chest. Then came the moment that would replay in my nightmares for months afterward. Mr. Harrison's voice took on an even more careful tone as he read, "To my wife, Margaret Ann Whitmore, I leave no financial assets, properties, or business interests, as she made no direct financial contribution to the accumulation of this estate during our marriage." The words hung in the air like poison gas. No financial assets, no properties, no contribution. The room fell into a suffocating silence. I couldn't breathe. 50 years of marriage reduced to a single sentence of dismissal. Every meal I'd cooked, every shirt I'd ironed, every sick child I'd nursed through the night, every business dinner I'd hosted with a smile, every dream I'd sacrificed, all of it dismissed as no contribution. My vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall. Not yet. I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Then David leaned back in his leather chair with a casual arrogance that made him unrecognizable to me. His voice was cold, clinical, completely devoid of empathy. "Mother has no rights here. Father left nothing for her because she never earned anything." He said it like he was stating a simple fact, like he was explaining basic mathematics to someone too simple to understand. There was no apology in his tone, no discomfort, no acknowledgement that he was destroying his mother with his words. Patricia nodded in agreement, examining her manicured nails as if this entire proceeding bored her. "You were just a housewife, Mom. This is about real work, real contributions. Dad built a business empire. You made casseroles." She actually laughed, a small dismissive sound that cut deeper than any knife. Real work. real contributions, as if the foundation I'd provided meant nothing, was nothing, had always been nothing. Michael remained silent, but his silence was its own form of betrayal. He didn't defend me. He didn't object to his siblings' cruelty. He simply sat there, complicit in his quietness, willing to let me be humiliated if it meant protecting his inheritance. The brother who used to curl up in my lap during thunderstorms, who'd cried in my arms when his first girlfriend broke his heart, who'd told me just last year that I was his hero, that boy was gone, replaced by a man who valued money over his own mother. Then the laughter started. It began with Patricia's sharp giggle, quickly joined by David's deeper chuckle. They were laughing at me, at my shock, at my pain, at my lifetime of service dismissed so casually. Even some of the associates in the room smirked, caught up in the casual cruelty of the moment. The sound filled the conference room, bouncing off the expensive wood paneling, each echo driving the knife deeper into my heart. I bowed my head, unable to hold it up any longer under the weight of their contempt. Tears streamed silently down my cheeks and dripped onto my folded hands. My pearl earrings, symbols of love and partnership, suddenly felt like shackles, reminders of promises broken and devotion unrewarded. I'd never felt so small, so erased, so completely worthless in my entire life. This was what 50 years of unconditional love had earned me, laughter and legal dismissal. In that moment, I wanted to disappear, to simply cease existing so I wouldn't have to feel this unbearable pain. But somewhere beneath the crushing humiliation and heartbreak, something else was stirring, something that would soon change everything. As the cruel laughter continued echoing around the conference room, I kept my head bowed, tears falling steadily onto my clenched hands. But through my grief, fragments of conversation began penetrating my consciousness, words spoken carelessly by people who thought I was too broken to pay attention, too defeated to matter anymore. What I heard in those next few moments revealed that this wasn't just callous indifference. This was something far more sinister. Patricia leaned toward David, her voice dropping to what she thought was a whisper, but was easily audible in the acoustics of the conference room. "I told you she wouldn't fight back. She's too passive, too conditioned to just accept whatever we decide." There was satisfaction in her tone, even pride, as if she'd predicted the outcome of an experiment and been proven correct. David responded with a quiet chuckle. "You were right. All those years of playing the dutiful wife made her weak. She doesn't even know how to advocate for herself." My heart, already shattered, seemed to break into even smaller pieces. They'd discussed this. They'd analyzed my personality, my decades of selflessness, and identified it as a weakness to exploit. The traits I'd considered virtues, patience, accommodation, putting others first, they'd weaponized against me. I kept my head down, but my ears were now hyper-focused, catching every word. Then David said something that made my blood turn to ice. Dad knew exactly what he was doing. We discussed this strategy 2 years ago when he first started showing signs of the dementia. 2 years ago, the words reverberated through my skull like a death knell. 2 years ago, Richard had just been diagnosed with early-stage cognitive decline. 2 years ago, I'd been sleeping in a chair beside his hospital bed after his heart surgery, feeding him soup when his hands trembled too much to hold the spoon, advocating for him with doctors, researching, treatments, doing everything humanly possible to extend his life and ease his suffering. While I'd been loving him with every fiber of my being, he'd been plotting my erasure. While I'd been his caregiver, his nurse, his devoted companion through the scariest time of his life, he'd been sitting in rooms with our son, a lawyer who knew exactly how to structure documents to leave me with nothing, planning how to dispose of me legally. The betrayal was so profound, so complete, that I felt physically nauseated. Michael spoke up for the first time, his voice carrying a note of guilt, but not enough to make him stop. The lawyer confirmed there's no way she can contest it. Everything was structured to comply with state law. Dad's personal assets were kept separate from marital property through that postnuptial agreement he had her sign back in 2020. A postnuptial agreement. My mind raced back to 2020, trying to remember. Then it hit me. Richard had brought home papers, said they were updates to our estate planning, routine documents that every couple needed to sign as they aged. He'd been so gentle, so reassuring. Just a formality, darling. This protects both of us. I'd signed without reading carefully, trusting my husband of 47 years completely. I'd literally signed away my own security while believing I was being responsible, Patricia added, her voice dripping with calculated coldness. And the beauty of it is that she can't claim she didn't know. Her signature is on every document. She agreed to everything. They were talking about me like I was a problem they'd successfully solved, an obstacle they'd cleverly maneuvered around. I wasn't their mother in this moment. I was a liability they'd neutralized through careful legal planning and emotional manipulation. David's next words confirmed the full scope of the conspiracy. Michael, did you transfer those funds from the joint accounts like we discussed? My youngest son, the one who'd always seemed the most sensitive, replied quietly, last month. Everything that was in accounts with her name has been moved to the estate accounts. She has access to about $5,000 in her personal checking account. That should last her a few months until she figures out her next steps. $5,000. After 50 years of marriage, after building a multi-million-dollar estate together, I was being left with $5,000, barely enough to cover a few months of basic expenses. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't Richard's confused final wishes. This was a coordinated, methodical plan executed by my husband and all three of my children to strip me of everything, while ensuring I had no legal recourse. The realization crashed over me like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about the inheritance. This was about erasing my value, my contribution, my very existence as a partner in this family. They'd all known. Richard, David, Patricia, Michael, and they'd all agreed. For at least 2 years. They'd been attending family dinners at my house, eating my food, accepting my love, while secretly planning to leave me destitute. Every smile had been a lie. Every "I love you, Mom" had been theater. Every Sunday gathering had been a performance staged by people who were counting down the days until they could divide up the spoils and discard me. I realized with horrifying clarity that I'd never really known any of them. The husband I'd loved for 50 years, the children I'd birthed and raised, they were strangers who'd been wearing masks, playing roles, waiting patiently for the moment when they could drop the pretense. And that moment was now. Here. In this cold conference room where my entire life was being reduced to legal language and asset distribution. The laughter had finally subsided, replaced by the shuffling of papers and quiet conversations about next steps. Selling the house, liquidating remaining assets, dividing proceeds. They were already moving forward, already planning their futures with their newfound wealth. I was still sitting at the end of the table, head bowed, tears drying on my cheeks. But something was shifting inside me. Beneath the grief and shock, beneath the pain of ultimate betrayal, a small flame was beginning to kindle. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something rawer, more primal. It was the survival instinct of a woman who just discovered she had nothing left to lose. I sat in that cold leather chair, feeling like I was drowning in deep water, unable to reach the surface for air. The voices around me became muffled and distant, as if I'd been submerged beneath waves of shock and grief. My chest felt impossibly tight, each breath a struggle against the crushing weight of betrayal pressing down on my ribs. 50 years. 50 years of my life had just been dismissed as worthless, and I couldn't comprehend how I'd arrived at this moment. Memories began flooding my mind in a relentless, torturous slideshow. Each one a reminder of everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd given, everything I'd believed mattered. I saw myself at 22 years old standing in our tiny first apartment, holding that university acceptance letter in trembling hands. I remembered the weight of that envelope, the potential it represented, a teaching career, independence, my own identity separate from anyone else. I'd placed it in a drawer and never looked at it again because Richard needed me. Because I believed building our life together was more important than building my own life. I remembered being pregnant with David, violently sick for months, unable to keep food down while Richard traveled for business. I'd suffered alone, cleaning up after myself, trying to stay strong for the baby growing inside me. When David was born, I'd held him in my arms and felt a love so fierce it physically hurt. I'd whispered promises to him. I'll always protect you. I'll always be here. I'll give you everything. And I had. I'd given him everything. Sleepless nights when he had colic, endless patience teaching him to read, money saved from grocery budgets to buy him the baseball glove he desperately wanted. I'd edited every single one of his college papers, staying up until 3 in the morning to help him succeed. That baby was now the man who'd just called me worthless. Patricia's face floated into my memory, her first day of kindergarten, clinging to my leg, terrified to let go. "Don't leave me, Mommy," she'd sobbed. "I need you." I'd volunteered in her classroom twice a week for 3 years so she'd feel secure. When she was 16 and her boyfriend broke her heart, she'd cried in my arms for hours while I stroked her hair and told her she was beautiful, worthy, enough. I'd hand-sewn decorations for her wedding for 6 months, my fingers bleeding from needle pricks because she'd wanted a fairy tale celebration but didn't have the budget. I'd given them $20,000 from my own mother's small inheritance as a down payment on their first house. That little girl was now the woman laughing at my humiliation. Michael's childhood illness appeared in my mind with vivid, painful clarity. He'd been 8 years old with a fever that spiked to 105 degrees. The hospital had sent us home with instructions to monitor him closely. I'd stayed awake for 72 hours straight, checking his temperature every 30 minutes, sponging his burning skin with cool cloths, praying to every god I could name that my baby would survive. Richard had slept through most of it. He had important meetings and needed his rest. When Michael recovered, he'd wrapped his thin arms around my neck and said, "You saved my life, Mommy." Now that boy had helped orchestrate my financial destruction. Every sacrifice scrolled through my consciousness like a horror film I couldn't stop watching. The friendships I'd let fade because there was no time. The art classes I'd abandoned because children needed to be driven to soccer practice. The job offers I'd turned down because Richard said a wife's place was at home. The dreams I'd folded up and stored away like winter clothes I'd never wear again. The 2 years I'd spent caring for Richard's mother while she died slowly from cancer, bathing her, managing her medications, holding her hand through the terror of her final days, while Richard and the children visited occasionally, praised me for being so capable, and then returned to their busy lives. I remembered business dinners where I'd smiled until my face hurt, entertaining Richard's clients and their wives, making everyone comfortable, being charming and gracious, while inside I felt invisible. I remembered Richard showing me off. "My wife is the secret to my success. She runs everything behind the scenes." I'd gloated at those words, believing they meant he valued me. Now I understood they were just pretty phrases, empty sounds that cost him nothing and obligated him to nothing. The worst memories were the most recent ones. Richard's final year. The dementia had made him paranoid, sometimes cruel. He'd accused me of stealing from him, of lying, of plotting against him. I'd absorbed his anger with patience, understanding it was the disease speaking, not the man I loved. I'd researched care facilities, managed his medications, advocated with doctors who didn't take me seriously because I was just the wife. I'd protected his dignity when he couldn't remember our children's names or where he was. I'd cleaned up after him when the illness robbed him of basic functions, never complaining, never showing disgust. because that's what love meant to me. And while I'd been doing all of that, while I'd been loving him through the worst period of his life, he'd been lucid enough to sit down with our son and plan my destruction. He'd been clear-headed enough to sign legal documents stripping me of everything. He'd had enough cognitive function to betray me, but had used his confusion as cover, as plausible deniability. I wasn't crying anymore. I'd moved beyond tears into a state of shock so profound it felt like numbness. My hands lay motionless in my lap. My breathing had become shallow and rapid. Somewhere distant, I heard Patricia say impatiently, "Can we wrap this up? I have a spa appointment at 3. She was already moving on, already spending her inheritance in her mind, while I sat there among the wreckage of my entire existence. I thought about the empty house waiting for me, the home they'd soon take away and sell. I thought about the small checking account with $5,000, a few months of survival before I'd be destitute. I thought about being 72 years old with no career, no recent work history, no retirement savings of my own, no safety net. I'd have to find some tiny apartment, maybe get a job as a store clerk if anyone would hire a woman my age, live on Social Security that would barely cover rent and food. This was what my life had been worth. This was the sum total of 50 years of devotion. I'd built their lives, their success, their comfort, and they'd decided I had no value. I was disposable, erasable, already erased. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to feel truly broken. Something inside me shifted. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was more like a key turning slowly in a rusty lock, opening a door I'd kept sealed for 72 years. Through the fog of devastation, through the crushing weight of betrayal, something ancient and primal began to stir. It started as a whisper in the deepest part of my consciousness, growing louder with each passing second. You don't have to accept this. I lifted my eyes from my lap and looked around the conference room with new clarity. Patricia was checking her watch impatiently, her diamond bracelet, a gift I'd helped Richard select for her 40th birthday, catching the light. David was scrolling through his phone, already mentally checked out of this meeting, probably reviewing emails about his next big case. Michael sat with his hands folded on the table, staring at nothing, guilt written across his face, but not enough guilt to make him speak up, to defend me, to do the right thing. They all thought I was broken. They thought I'd accept this humiliation with the same quiet grace I'd shown for 50 years. They'd calculated my response based on a lifetime of observing me put everyone else's needs first, swallow my own pain, sacrifice my own dignity for the sake of family harmony. They thought they knew me completely. They thought I was predictable, manageable, defeated. But as I sat there watching them prepare to divide up their spoils and move on with their lives, I remembered something Richard had said to me years ago during one of our rare arguments. We'd been disagreeing about whether to send David to an expensive private school. Richard had wanted to save money. I'd advocated fiercely for our son's education. I'd researched scholarships, created budgets, presented a plan. In the end, Richard had relented, and later that night he'd pulled me close and said with genuine admiration in his voice, "You always surprise me, Maggie. Just when I think I know you completely, you show me you're stronger than I gave you credit for." At the time, I'd taken it as a compliment, proof that my quiet strength was recognized and valued. Now those words echoed in my mind with different meaning, stronger than he gave me credit for. He'd underestimated me then, and he'd underestimated me now. They all had. They'd mistaken kindness for weakness, patience for passivity, selflessness for spinelessness. They'd confused my choice to put family first with an inability to fight for myself. But I'd spent 50 years making incredibly difficult decisions. I'd navigated the complexities of raising 3 children, often while Richard traveled for work. I'd managed household crises, medical emergencies, financial tight spots in our early years. I'd negotiated with contractors, advocated with school principals, mediated between fighting children, handled neighborhood disputes, organized community fundraisers. I'd run the entire infrastructure of our lives while Richard focused on his career. Every one of those experiences required strength, strategy, and steel. I hadn't been weak. I'd been devoted, and there was a crucial difference between those two things. I thought about every problem I'd solved over the decades, every crisis I'd managed when Richard was too busy. I remembered the year our basement flooded and Richard was in another state on business. I'd coordinated with plumbers, insurance adjusters, and restoration companies, making dozens of decisions while standing in 2 inches of water. I remembered when David had been falsely accused of cheating in high school. Richard had been ready to accept the school's judgment, but I'd fought, gathering evidence, requesting meetings, advocating until the truth came out and my son's name was cleared. I wasn't just a housewife who made casseroles. I was a strategist who'd been running complex operations for half a century. I was a negotiator who'd resolved countless conflicts. I was a problem solver who'd faced obstacles much more challenging than greedy children and legal documents. I'd simply never had to use those skills for myself before because I'd always had someone to protect. Now I only had myself, and maybe that was enough. Slowly, deliberately, I lifted my head and wiped my tears with a steady hand. My fingers no longer trembled. My breathing had evened out. Something fundamental had changed in my physiology. Adrenaline mixing with determination, grief transmuting into fuel. I looked at each of my children in turn, really looked at them, seeing them clearly perhaps for the first time. They weren't the babies I'd nursed or the children I'd nurtured. They were adults who'd made calculated choices to hurt me, and adults who made choices had to face consequences. Patricia noticed my changed posture first. Her expression flickered with something that might have been uncertainty. David glanced up from his phone, his brow furrowing slightly as he registered the shift in the room's energy. Even Michael seemed to sense something different, sitting up straighter in his chair. When I finally spoke, my voice was quiet but clear, carrying none of the broken devastation they'd heard moments before. "Is that everything the will says? Is there anything else Mr. Harrison needs to read?" The lawyer looked uncomfortable and glanced quickly at David before responding. "Well, there is one additional item, Mrs. Whitmore, but—" David cut him off sharply. "That's not relevant. We've covered everything that matters." But I kept my eyes locked on the lawyer, and I saw something in his expression. Hesitation, maybe even sympathy. "Mr. Harrison," I said with a firmness that surprised even me, "if there's anything else my husband left, I have the right to know about it, don't I?" The room had gone very quiet. The confident arrogance that had filled the space minutes ago was evaporating, replaced by something that looked very much like worry on my children's faces. Mr. Harrison's hand moved almost unconsciously toward his briefcase, and in that small gesture, I knew there was more to this story. Richard had left something else, something my children didn't want me to see, and I was going to make absolutely certain that I saw it. What my children didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that I'd been taking action since the moment I discovered that estate division document in David's briefcase 3 days ago. I wasn't the helpless victim they imagined me to be. I'd simply learned over 50 years that sometimes the most powerful weapon is allowing people to underestimate you while you work quietly behind the scenes. The day after I'd found those papers, I'd made a phone call that would change everything. I'd contacted Elizabeth Chen, a lawyer I'd met 5 years earlier at a charity fundraiser for domestic violence survivors. We'd bonded over our shared passion for helping vulnerable women, and we'd stayed in touch through occasional coffee meetings and volunteer work. Elizabeth ran a practice specializing in elder law and estate disputes. More importantly, she was brilliant, compassionate, and had a reputation for fighting fiercely for clients who'd been taken advantage of by family members. When I'd called her, my voice shaking but determined, she'd invited me to her office immediately. I'd driven there with the estate document hidden in my purse, feeling like a spy engaged in some covert operation. In her warm, book-lined office, I'd laid out everything. The whispered conversations, the sudden emotional distance from my children, the document detailing their plans to sell my home and leave me with nothing. Elizabeth had listened with increasing concern, taking careful notes, asking probing questions. Then she'd asked something that made my breath catch. "Margaret, did Richard seem like himself in his final year? Did his personality or judgment change significantly?" I'd immediately thought about the dementia diagnosis, the paranoia, the cruel accusations, the confusion. "Yes," I'd whispered. "He became someone I didn't recognize. His doctor mentioned early-stage dementia, but Richard refused most of the recommended testing. He said doctors were trying to make money off him." Elizabeth had leaned forward, her expression serious. "If Richard lacked mental capacity when he executed this will, it can be challenged. But Margaret, I need you to understand something important. You have rights regardless. In this state, 50 years of marriage means you're entitled to a significant portion of marital property, no matter what any will says. Community property laws protect spouses. Your husband could distribute his separate premarital assets as he wished, but anything accumulated during your marriage, you have legal claims to that." Hope had flickered in my chest for the first time in days. But the document said I signed away my rights in some post-nuptial agreement in 2020. Elizabeth had requested copies of everything, and when I described the circumstances, Richard presenting papers as routine estate planning, assuring me it was just formalities, my signing without independent legal counsel, her eyes had hardened. Post-nuptial agreements signed under duress, without full disclosure or without independent legal representation can often be invalidated. We have grounds to fight this, Margaret. Strong grounds. But then she'd ask me the most important question of all. Beyond the legal fight, which could take years and be emotionally draining, is there anything else? Any other documentation? Any evidence of your husband's true wishes before his mind deteriorated? I'd sat in silence for a long moment, and then I'd remembered something that had seemed strange at the time, but now took on enormous significance. 2 months before Richard died, during one of his increasingly rare moments of clarity, he'd called me into his study with unusual urgency. His eyes had been lucid that day, more like the Richard I'd known for decades. Tears had been streaming down his face. "Maggie," he'd said, his voice breaking, "I need you to do something for me. I need you to promise me something, and you can't ask questions. Can you do that?" I'd been so relieved to see him coherent that I'd agreed immediately. He'd handed me a sealed manila envelope, thick with something inside. His hands had trembled as he passed it to me. "If anything feels wrong after I'm gone, if you feel betrayed, if you feel abandoned, if the children treat you badly, I need you to give this directly to Jonathan Harrison, my lawyer, not to the children, not to anyone else, directly to Jonathan, and tell him it's the item I discussed with him in our private meeting." His intensity had frightened me. "Richard, what is this?" I'd asked. "Promise me, Margaret. Promise me you won't open it. Promise me you'll deliver it only if something feels wrong. If everything goes well, if you're taken care of, then destroy it unopened. But if I've somehow hurt you, if I've failed you, then Jonathan will know what to do with it." He'd gripped my hands with surprising strength. "I'm not always myself anymore, Maggie. Sometimes my mind plays tricks. Sometimes I say and do things I don't mean. This is me, the real me, trying to protect you from the version of me that might not be in control." At the time, I hadn't fully understood. The dementia was still relatively mild, and I'd thought he was being overly dramatic. But I'd promised, and I'd kept that envelope in my bedroom dresser, hidden beneath my winter sweaters. After finding the estate document in David's briefcase, I'd retrieved that envelope. It was still sealed, still heavy with whatever Richard had placed inside. I'd honored his request. I hadn't opened it. Instead, I'd taken it directly to Jonathan Harrison's office the morning before the will reading. I'd walked in without an appointment, told his secretary it was urgent, and within 10 minutes I was sitting across from him. "Mr. Harrison," I'd said, placing the envelope on his desk. "My husband gave this to me with specific instructions to deliver it to you if anything felt wrong after his death. Everything feels wrong." Jonathan had stared at the envelope, his face draining of color. "He actually gave this to you?" he'd whispered. "I wasn't sure he'd go through with it." Then he'd looked at me with something like pity and respect combined. "Mrs. Whitmore, your husband made me promise that if you brought this to me, I would ensure it was presented at the will reading, after the primary will was read, but before the meeting concluded. He said you'd know when the time was right." Now, sitting in this conference room, watching my children's confidence begin to crack, I knew this was the moment Richard had foreseen. This was why he'd created that insurance policy during a moment of clarity. Somewhere in his deteriorating mind, the real Richard, the man who'd once loved me, who'd once valued our partnership, had fought back against whatever darkness was consuming him. He'd left me a weapon, and I was about to use it. The tension in the lawyer's office had become almost unbearable, thick enough to choke on. Mr. Harrison shifted, uncomfortably in his chair, his hand resting on his briefcase with an uncertainty that sent visible ripples of anxiety through my children. David's confident posture had stiffened, his shoulders tense, as he leaned forward with narrowed eyes. Patricia had stopped checking her watch and was now staring at the lawyer with an expression caught between confusion and growing alarm. Even Michael, who'd been avoiding eye contact for the entire meeting, was now watching Mr. Harrison with obvious concern. "There's nothing else," David stated firmly, his lawyer voice activating, authoritative, commanding, brooking no argument. "We've reviewed everything. Father's will was clear and legally sound. There's no reason to prolong this meeting." But his words had a desperate edge that betrayed his anxiety. He was trying to control a situation that was slipping away from him, and he knew it. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, and I watched a fascinating transformation occur across his features. The neutral, careful expression he'd worn while reading Richard's will melted away, replaced by something that looked distinctly like moral conviction. "Actually, Mr. Whitmore," he said, addressing David with deliberate formality, "there is one more item. Your father left very specific instructions about a sealed document to be presented after the primary will was read, but only under certain conditions." "What conditions?" Patricia demanded, her voice sharp with suspicion. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening. "Father never mentioned any additional documents to us. If there were additional instructions, we would have been informed. We're the executors of the estate." "The conditions," Mr. Harrison continued, his voice gaining strength, "were that this document would only be presented if Mrs. Whitmore was present at the reading and if she personally requested to see it." His eyes met mine across the table, and I saw something in them. Respect, perhaps, or admiration for whatever was about to unfold. "Mrs. Whitmore, you asked if there was anything else. There is." I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, feel it in my throat. This was the moment. Whatever Richard had sealed in that envelope, whatever truth he'd preserved during his brief window of clarity, was about to be revealed. I had no idea what it contained. I'd kept my promise and never opened it. But I trusted that the real Richard, the man I'd loved before dementia poisoned his mind, had left something that would matter. "Yes," I said, my voice remarkably steady considering the earthquake happening inside my chest. "I want to see it. I want to see everything my husband left for me." David shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is irregular. This is highly irregular. Mr. Harrison, as the primary executor and as an attorney myself, I'm formally objecting to any deviation from the standard will reading process. Whatever document you're referencing, I demand to review it first to ensure—" "Sit down, David," Mr. Harrison said with quiet but unmistakable authority. It was the tone of a man who'd practiced law for 40 years and wasn't about to be bullied by someone young enough to be his son. Your father's instructions were explicit, witnessed, and legally binding. This isn't subject to your approval or review." The lawyer stood and walked to the antique safe built into his office wall. The room watched in absolute silence as he entered the combination, each click of the dial sounding impossibly loud. My mouth had gone dry. My hands were trembling again, but this time not from devastation, from anticipation, from hope, from the terrible uncertainty of not knowing what came next. Patricia's voice came out as almost a hiss. "Whatever this is, it won't change anything. The will is legal. We've had it reviewed by 3 different attorneys. Mother has no claim to—" But her words died as Mr. Harrison swung the safe door open and removed a small USB drive along with a sealed envelope marked with Richard's handwriting. I could see my name written across it in his distinctive script. "For Margaret, the truth." Mr. Harrison held the items carefully, almost reverently. "Your father recorded a video message and left accompanying documentation. His instructions stated that this was to be his true testament, and that it superseded previous documents if conditions indicated that his judgment had been compromised when those documents were created." Video message? Michael spoke for the first time in minutes, his voice barely above a whisper. Dad never said anything about making a video. The guilt on his face had intensified into something approaching panic. Whatever conspiracy they'd all agreed to, whatever plan they'd executed with their father's approval, was about to be exposed. Mr. Harrison moved to his computer and inserted the USB drive. The large monitor on the wall flickered to life, and suddenly Richard's face filled the screen, gaunt, exhausted, his skin gray with illness. But his eyes. Oh, his eyes were clear, alert, present. This was Richard as I remembered him, before the confusion and paranoia completely took over. The timestamp in the corner showed the video had been recorded just 8 weeks before his death. My breath caught in my throat. Tears were already forming, blurring my vision. Whatever he was about to say, whatever truth he'd preserved in this digital time capsule, I knew it would change everything. I could feel it in the electric silence of the room, in the way my children had gone absolutely still, in the way Mr. Harrison stood with his hand on the monitor as if steadying himself for what was to come. Richard's recorded image drew a shaky breath, and when he spoke, his voice was weak but determined, every word clearly enunciated with the effort of someone fighting against time and deteriorating cognition. "If you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and something has gone terribly wrong with my affairs. Margaret, my darling wife, I need you to know the truth." The room held its collective breath as the video began to play, and I leaned forward, my entire world balanced on whatever my husband was about to reveal from beyond the grave. Richard's voice came through the speakers, stronger than I'd heard it in months before his death, each word deliberate and filled with emotion. "If you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and something has gone terribly wrong with my affairs. Margaret, my darling wife, I need you to know the truth about what happened and why I had to fight against my own failing mind to protect you." On screen, Richard's eyes filled with tears that spilled down his hollowed cheeks. His hands trembled as he adjusted the camera, bringing his face closer. 6 months ago, David came to me with a proposal. I was already experiencing confusion, forgetting conversations, losing track of time, saying things I didn't mean. The dementia was taking hold and I was terrified. His voice cracked with the weight of that fear. David sat in my study and laid out a plan. He had spreadsheets, legal documents, financial projections. He said that if I restructured my will to exclude you entirely and divide everything among the children, they would ensure I received the absolute best medical care available. I heard Patricia gasp beside me, but I couldn't look away from the screen. Richard continued, tears flowing freely now. He showed me brochures for expensive treatment centers in Switzerland, experimental medications that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, specialists who might slow the progression of my disease. He painted a picture of hope, of more time, more clarity, more life. And all it would cost was your security, Margaret. All I had to do was sign papers that erased your 50 years of contribution. David had gone completely white, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound emerging. On screen, Richard's face contorted with grief and shame. I was weak. I was scared of losing my mind completely, of becoming a shell of myself. I was terrified of the darkness coming for me, and David offered me a lifeline. So I signed. I signed documents that betrayed the only person who'd ever truly loved me, the woman who'd given me everything, who'd sacrificed her own dreams so I could build mine. Richard leaned closer to the camera, his intensity burning through the screen. But Patricia and Michael were part of it too. Patricia suggested that if I left you the house, you'd just waste it or mismanage it. She said you'd never worked a real job, never understood money, and that leaving you assets would be irresponsible. Michael stayed quiet, but his silence was agreement. They all sat in my study like vultures circling a dying animal, calculating how to divide up the spoils before I was even gone. "That's a lie," David shouted, jumping to his feet. He was demented. He didn't know what he was saying. This video is the product of a diseased mind and has no legal— "Sit down and let it play," Mr. Harrison commanded with steel in his voice, "or I'll have security escort you out, and you can contest this in court." Richard's voice grew stronger on the recording, fueled by righteous anger. "I signed those papers during a period of confusion and fear. But 3 weeks later, I had a moment of clarity, the kind that comes sometimes when the fog lifts briefly. I realized what I'd done. I'd sold out my wife, my partner, my best friend for the promise of treatments that probably wouldn't work anyway. I'd let our children manipulate me into committing the ultimate betrayal." He wiped his eyes with a shaking hand. "So I called Jonathan Harrison to my house when I was alone. I told him everything. I recorded this video as my true will, my real testimony, created during a documented period of mental clarity. Jonathan witnessed it, had it notarized, brought in a doctor to verify my cognitive state that day. This video is legally binding, Margaret. It supersedes everything I signed during my periods of confusion." The camera zoomed slightly closer to Richard's face, and I could see the man I'd married 50 years ago fighting through the ravages of disease to protect me one last time. This is my real will, recorded while I still have enough of my mind left to know right from wrong. Everything I own, the business, the houses, the investments, the bank accounts, 50% belongs to you, Margaret, not as a gift, not as charity, as recognition of your equal partnership in building everything we have. Patricia was crying now, but they were tears of rage and frustration, not remorse. Michael had his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. David stood frozen, his legal mind probably already calculating angles, loopholes, ways to fight this revelation. Richard's voice softened, becoming tender. "Margaret, you gave me 50 years of devotion. You sacrificed your teaching dreams, your artistic talents, your own identity to build our family. You earned every single penny through your labor, your sacrifice, and your unconditional love. The only reason I was free to build a business empire was because you built the foundation that made it possible. You were never just a housewife. You were the CEO of our family, and you did it without salary, without recognition, without complaint." He paused, gathering strength for what came next. "The remaining 50% goes to our children, but with conditions. They must treat you with respect and dignity. They must acknowledge your contributions publicly, and they must each contribute 100 hours per year to a foundation we're establishing in your name for non-traditional students, people who sacrifice their education for family, just like you did." Richard's expression hardened, his voice turning cold as he addressed his children, directly. David, Patricia, Michael, if you humiliated your mother today, if you laughed at her pain, if you tried to take everything and leave her with nothing, then you've proven you learned nothing from me about honor, loyalty, or love. Greed is a disease that destroys families. Your mother is a treasure you never deserved, and I can only hope that losing your inheritance teaches you the lesson I failed to teach you while alive. The video image of Richard leaned back, exhausted from the effort of recording. His final words were addressed only to me. Maggie, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I was weak. I'm sorry I let them manipulate me. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder against my own failing mind. But this video is my last act of love, my final attempt to protect you the way you protected me every single day of our marriage. You were always stronger than I gave you credit for. You're the hero of this story, not me. I love you. I've always loved you, and I hope someday you can forgive me. The screen went black. The silence in the room was absolutely deafening. The video ended, and for several long moments, no one moved. The black screen seemed to hold us all suspended in time, processing what had just been revealed. Then Mr. Harrison picked up the sealed envelope Richard had left and carefully opened it, removing several legal documents. His voice was steady and professional as he read, but I detected an undercurrent of satisfaction. Mrs. Whitmore, these documents constitute a holographic will, properly witnessed by myself, a notary public, and Dr. Stephen Martinez, who performed a cognitive assessment of your husband on the day of recording and certified him as mentally competent. This will supersede all previous testamentary documents. He slid the papers across the table toward me. You now own 50% of the entire estate outright. The business, all properties including this house, investment accounts, and liquid assets. The total value is approximately $7.3 million. Your share is $3.65 million, which will be transferred to accounts in your sole name within 30 business days. I stared at the documents, the numbers swimming before my eyes. $3.65 million. Financial security for the rest of my life. The ability to live with dignity, to make my own choices, to never be dependent on children who'd proven they couldn't be trusted. But more than the money, vindication. Richard had seen what they'd done. He'd fought back. He'd protected me even as his mind was failing. Mr. Harrison continued, the remaining 50% is to be divided among your 3 children, but with the conditions your husband specified. Each must contribute 100 hours annually to the Margaret Whitmore Foundation for non-traditional students or forfeit that year's distribution. Each must sign a public statement acknowledging your contributions to the family's success. And Mrs. Whitmore, you have complete authority over the foundation and can establish whatever guidelines you deem appropriate. David finally found his voice, though it came out strangled. We'll contest this. That video shows a man who was clearly ill, possibly coerced. No court will... But Mr. Harrison cut him off with a sharp look. Mr. Whitmore, I've been practicing estate law for 42 years. Your father took every precaution. We have medical documentation, witness statements, video evidence of his clarity. You can contest if you wish, but you'll lose, waste years in litigation, and spend hundreds of thousands in legal fees. Or you can accept reality. I looked at my 3 children, really looked at them. David's face was flushed with anger and humiliation, his carefully constructed plan demolished. Patricia was crying, but I could see it was self-pity, not remorse. She was mourning the loss of money, not the loss of her mother's trust. Michael at least had the decency to look genuinely ashamed, his eyes red and unable to meet mine. For a long moment, I said nothing. I let them sit in their discomfort, their exposure, their defeat. Then I spoke, my voice calm and measured. I'm not going to cut you out completely. Despite everything, you're still my children, but things will be very different from now on." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "The main house stays mine. I'll be establishing the foundation your father mentioned, and it will provide scholarships for people like me, those who gave up their education for family and want a second chance. I'll be hiring staff to run it, and yes, you'll each contribute your time or lose your inheritance." I stood up, my legs surprisingly steady beneath me. "Your distributions will be structured over 10 years, not given as lump sums. You'll receive enough to be comfortable, but you'll have to earn the rest through actions, not just entitlement. And you'll each meet with me quarterly to discuss your involvement with the foundation. If you choose not to participate, that's your decision, but your payments will stop." Patricia opened her mouth to object, but I held up my hand. "I'm not finished. Your father tried to teach you that money isn't everything, that character and integrity matter more than wealth. I'm going to finish that lesson. You wanted to treat me as worthless because I never earned anything? Now you'll learn what real work means. Work that helps others, work that requires sacrifice, work that builds something meaningful instead of just accumulating wealth." I gathered my purse and the legal documents Mr. Harrison had given me. "I need time away from all of you. I need to process what you tried to do to me, how you laughed at my pain, how you calculated my erasure while eating at my table and accepting my love. Maybe someday I'll be able to forgive you. Today is not that day." I walked toward the door, my head held high, my spine straight. At the threshold, I turned back one last time. "Your father said I was stronger than he gave me credit for. He was right. I've spent 50 years being strong for everyone else. Now I'm going to be strong for myself." Over the following months, my life transformed in ways I'd never imagined. I sold several of the investment properties and downsized to a beautiful cottage near the ocean, something I dreamed about for years but never voiced because Richard preferred the suburbs. The house had large windows overlooking the water, a small garden where I grew vegetables and flowers, and a studio space where I finally returned to painting, the passion I'd abandoned at 22. I reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with over the decades, women who welcomed me back with open arms and no judgment. I joined a book club, started taking morning walks on the beach, and discovered that I actually enjoyed my own company. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't defined by my service to others. I was simply Margaret, not wife, not mother, not caregiver, just myself. The Margaret Whitmore Foundation became my greatest joy. We provided scholarships and support services for adults returning to education after years away. Many were women like me who'd sacrificed their dreams for family. Watching them walk across graduation stages, seeing their faces light up with accomplishment, knowing I'd helped make that possible, it gave my life a purpose I'd never experienced before. My grandchildren still visited, and those relationships remained intact. Children are resilient and adaptable, and they didn't understand the adult conflicts. I made sure they knew their Nana loved them, even if things were complicated with their parents. Michael was the only one of my children who made genuine efforts to rebuild our relationship. He apologized, not just once, but repeatedly, with actions backing up his words. He volunteered extra hours at the foundation, showed up for our quarterly meetings prepared and engaged, and slowly, painfully, we began to forge a new relationship built on honesty rather than obligation. David and Patricia remained distant. They participated minimally in the foundation, clearly viewing it as a burden they had to endure to maintain their inheritance. Our interactions were polite but cold, conducted through lawyers and formal meetings. It hurt, but I'd learned that some relationships can't be repaired, and that acceptance isn't the same as defeat. I found peace in my new life, real peace, not the fragile contentment I'd maintained for 50 years by ignoring my own needs, but deep, authentic peace that came from finally valuing myself. I had my dignity, my independence, and my voice. and I discovered something profound. I didn't need their approval or their love to be whole. I'd always been whole. I just needed to see it myself. As I sit on my porch now, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of orange and gold, I often reflect on the journey that brought me here. The gentle sound of waves has replaced the chaos of that conference room. The salty breeze has cleansed away years of invisible servitude, and for the first time in 7 decades, I feel completely at peace with who I am. My small cottage isn't grand like the house I raised my children in, but it's mine in a way that old house never was. Every piece of furniture, every painting on the wall, every plant in the garden, they're all choices I made for myself, not for anyone else's approval or comfort. I've learned so much in these months of rebuilding my life. The most important lesson is this. For 50 years, I believed that selfless love and unconditional sacrifice would automatically earn respect, security, and value in return. I thought that if I gave everything, my dreams, my time, my identity, my family would recognize my worth and protect me when I needed them most. I was wrong. Not because love and sacrifice are meaningless, but because I never taught anyone, including myself, that what I gave had value. I treated my contributions as invisible, expected, ordinary, and people believed me. I think about what Richard's betrayal actually taught me, beyond the pain and devastation. It showed me that you cannot rely solely on others to validate your worth. Your value exists independent of whether anyone acknowledges it. Being kind, being devoted, being selfless, these are beautiful qualities, but they cannot be your only qualities. You must also advocate for yourself. You must also protect yourself. You must also believe that you deserve dignity and security, not as gifts from others, but as fundamental rights. The cruelest part of my story wasn't Richard's dementia-fueled betrayal, or even his weakness in allowing our children to manipulate him. The cruelest part was that my own children, whom I'd loved with every fiber of my being, thought so little of my lifetime of contribution that they laughed at my pain. They'd watched me sacrifice for decades and concluded that sacrifice made me worthless rather than invaluable. That's the danger of invisible labor. It becomes so expected that people forget it's labor at all. But here's the beautiful part that I want everyone watching to understand. I discovered I didn't need them to validate my worth. I always had value. I'd run complex operations for 50 years, managing households, raising children, supporting a husband's career, organizing communities. Those skills didn't disappear just because they'd never been compensated with a salary. That strength didn't evaporate just because I'd used it to serve others rather than myself. I'd simply needed to see my own power, and once I did, everything changed. I learned that being kind doesn't mean being invisible. Being devoted doesn't mean being disposable. Being loving doesn't mean accepting mistreatment. You can be all of those beautiful things while still maintaining boundaries, still demanding respect, still fighting for yourself when necessary. In fact, true strength is knowing when to stop sacrificing and start surviving. I gave my family everything, and I don't regret the love I showed or the life I built. But I should have also taught them, through my words and my actions, that everything I gave had immense value. I should have insisted on partnership rather than accepting servitude. I should have maintained my own identity alongside my roles as wife and mother. Those lessons came late for me, but they don't have to come late for others. The moral of this story is simple but profound. Never let anyone, not even family, not even people you love deeply, convince you that your sacrifices don't matter. Love is important, essential even, but so is self-respect, so is self-preservation, so is knowing your own worth. And remember this, greed will always reveal someone's true character. When money is involved, you discover who people really are beneath the masks they wear. Some people will surprise you with their integrity. Others will devastate you with their selfishness. But both revelations are valuable because they show you the truth. Your contributions matter, whether they're paid or unpaid, visible or invisible, celebrated or taken for granted. The work of building families, maintaining homes, and supporting others' dreams is real work that creates real value. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And don't wait until you're 72 years old and facing betrayal to recognize your own power. See it now. Claim it now. Protect it now. Now, I want to hear from you, and I genuinely mean this. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have forgiven your children completely and maintained the relationships at any cost? Would you have cut them off entirely and never spoken to them again? Or would you have done what I did? Created boundaries, demanded accountability, but left the door open for genuine reconciliation? There's no right answer, and I'm truly curious about your perspective. Also, tell me this. Have you ever experienced a moment where you realized people were taking your contributions for granted? How did you handle it? What did you learn? Your stories might help someone else who's struggling with similar feelings of invisibility or lack of appreciation. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have an honest conversation. This is a safe space for real talk about family dynamics, sacrifice, and self-worth. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own relationships and your own value, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Maybe someone who's always putting others first and forgetting to value themselves. And subscribe to this channel for more powerful real-life stories that explore the complicated truth about family, love, betrayal, and redemption. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for being part of this community. Remember this above everything else. You are worthy of respect, always. Not because of what you do for others, but because of who you are. Your value is inherent, not earned. And anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve access to your love, your time, or your energy. Take care of yourselves out there. Protect your peace. Know your worth. And never, ever let anyone make you feel small.